Okay, go live.
Okay, hi there. My name is Augusto Teixeira. I'm head of publications of Brazilian Defense Studies Association and professor at Federal University of Paraíba. And in this morning, we are here with Brazilian Defense Studies Association and GEPSI from the University of Brasilia. The Brazilian Association of Defense Studies is joining efforts with other projects in Brazil, especially Astrus PROCAD research project, and also with GEPSI at UNB in Brazil. The idea here is to organize and create the opportunity for Brazilian community that studies defense studies to have a broader and deeper understanding about the geopolitical impacts of the actual Ukrainian crisis. And for that, we will have here with us Professor Fabiano Miazuk and Professor Victoria Panova. That said, you can accompany this event in our YouTube channel, which we already invite you to follow and to like our channel also. And you can make your questions in YouTube that will be used in the second moment of this conference for a broader debate between our guests here, okay? That being said, we are very glad to have you with us in this morning. We know that's a very complicated moment, and it's very important to have your time and have the opportunity to hear a Russian professor that can give us a glimpse of the reality, another perspective. Professor Fabiano, who is a huge scholar about Russia and Eastern Europe, and of course, the opportunity to debate this issue with Professor Juliano Cortinhas, who is the moderator of this event with me. Okay, that being said, I would like to pass the word to Professor Juliano, and thank you very much in name of the ABED.
Thank you so much, Augusto. It's a great pleasure to be here with you and with our guests and our speakers. Thank you so much for organizing this with me. I'd like to also thank ABED, the Brazilian Association of Defense Studies, GEPSI, which is our study and research group in international security at the University of Brasilia. Also, the research project in which Augusto and I are engaged together that researches missiles and rockets in the Brazilian dissuasion system, the PROCAD Astrus project. So we thank CAPES for supporting us in organizing this kind of event. We have the honor to have two very acknowledged professors that deal with Russian foreign policy and Russian strategic approach. I would like to introduce firstly Victoria Panova, who is with us, and then after she finishes, we'll pass the floor to Fabiano Miazuk. We will certainly learn a lot from them. As I said when I was advertising this event, I think that we are in a very crucial moment, and we need to learn more about the different perspectives that are related to this very special moment in which we're living. It's probably, but I would like to hear that from our speakers. But it's probably a moment of a big transition in the international system. As we all know, different perspectives find different ways of being advertised internationally. And I think that it is going to be very important for us to hear one of the perspectives from Victoria that are not being so well advertised and that are not being heard in Brazil. So I will thank Victoria Panova a lot for being here with us and for accepting this, I would say, challenge to talk about how Russia has been and how herself has been perceiving this moment, and she very very nicely accepted the invitation and this challenge. And as the very good academic that she is, I'm certain that she will be more than open to ask and answer, especially answer all the questions that we pose to her. So Victoria is the Vice President for International Relations of the Far Eastern Federal University in Russia. She is Women 20 Sherpa for Russia, the advisor to the director of the Russian Institute for Strategic Studies. Victoria, it is a great pleasure to see you again. I thank you so much for accepting the invitation. The floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Juliana. Indeed, it's a real great pleasure for me to be here. To bet that the topic we're discussing is not funny at all, but I'm really enjoying seeing you, all of you guys, albeit online, and I do hope that first, like COVID, and then further difficulties in the international arena, kind of not allowing for too much interaction, face-to-face interaction between us, but I hope we'll go over that at the moment, quite soon. So let me give you, I understand I'm talking to professionals mostly, so you would be more or less kind of including the audience knowing what I'm talking about, but let me just put several general statements, and maybe if you need more details on what I say, maybe we can go with it later on with the discussion. First of all, what we witnessed with their special military operation in Ukraine has not started on the 24th of February. Definitely it has started much earlier, and there's been quite a lot of things done. Of course, lots of mistakes on both sides, including on Russian side. But a lot has also been done in order to try, for us at least, and I've been watching that, to try to build the world without new iron curtains. So let me start with the breakup of the Soviet Union very briefly. I myself was a teenager at that point, and I remember that we really had lots of hopes, and I know our elites had lots of hopes for their new start, new world with the West, and new arrangements where we all are friends, we all are brothers and sisters, and we all could come up with a world where we are equal, right? So there is respect, mutual respect for each other. Interests of the country is not ignored. And we realized that there are certain points, each of us realized that our security is indivisible. Because as you understand, as you as defense and IR and political scholars, you understand that security dilemma is about if you lose the sovereignty, if you lose your ability to secure your interests, you're no longer back there. You're no longer on their political map. What we had with their demise of the Soviet Union, it was kind of some activities from the West, but it was also not the demise of the Soviet, but their transition to from communism to capitalism was their mutual desire of the people in there. As I said, there was really enthusiasm for this future beautiful world with no dividing lines. Little by little, we started being kind of really appalled because their talk of the NATO enlargement, you've heard a lot about it a lot, that this is one of the major Russian concerns, but this is not a kind of baby, this is not a stupid talk. I know for Brazil, defense is somewhat different. In Latin America, you don't have this kind of notion of external enemy that much. But throughout history, Russia has had to secure its borders, it had to secure its own sovereignty. And we have this understanding of having to survive. And but imagine that suddenly you are in a world where your neighbors are being kind of recruited into there by somebody who doesn't like you so much, who doesn't want you to be strong and prosperous and healthy. They are recruited into their common military alliance. Of course, you would feel somewhat threatened. That's normal. And this was especially strange that the NATO enlargement was announced when Russia was in fact giving one step after the other, everything the West was demanding of it. And that is why it was quite ununderstandable. This is number one. Number two, when we were talking not just about NATO expansion, but as I said, Russia has this history of having the West introduce sanitary cordons against it. And that's why, of course, it needs an environment that is friendly and neutral around it. Because sanitary cordons are is something where you put the countries that would ensure that you're under kind of threat all the time. This happened after First World War and the Second World War. And this started happening similarly in the early 90s, when Russia was not even thinking of saying anything against the West. Instead of providing for another environment, which Russian political elite was suggesting, we suggested that OSCE could be a centerpiece of this architecture, so that NATO was no longer needed to be there, because Warsaw Pact was no longer there. So, and OSCE included all the countries that were in NATO and Warsaw Pact. And it had all three baskets: political and military, economic, and humanitarian cultural cooperation as well. So that is why it was very much promoted by Russia to build this new architecture. And that's why in Budapest summit in 1994, we actually saw this organization being born, which was later on used just for the third basket, as we call it, for humanitarian cases, but it never encompassed any longer after that all the other areas that are vital for survival of the state. And this is, of course, was a blow that we had to live with. What we see now, I can also remember, but this could be a bit too emotional, and I still don't understand why only few media from the West would show it, and in case, and also when they show it, why this would not even be taken into account. Those 8 years when people were actually dying in Donbass. Why I say that? I actually don't believe any media, no official media, neither from the West nor from Russia. But why I can say about Donbass and their shelling and how those people felt is because I've been talking to a number of them. Some of them fled to Russia and were doing some jobs like manicure lady. And some of them were relatives of my very close friends, and they've been actually telling horrifying stories of how they would be hiding in the basements from shelling of the Ukrainian army, just because they were Russian speaking and they wanted to keep their Russian language. And this has been going on for 8 years. Those Minsk agreements negotiated were never implemented, never. And no matter how hard we tried to talk to them, and now actually I always would say Russian state or Russian government, and then now I'm saying we, because actually this anti-Russia moment that we're witnessing from the West, in fact, is consolidating us. It's really painful to see how the West tries to portray that some people's lives are not equal to the lives of the others. This is something unacceptable. It's at least, I think it's about 14,000 people at least died over the 8 years from shelling, and more than 100 kids from among this number. This is serious. And I know there was, but for some reason it's also not information distributed. There were evidence that Russia had that those people would be there would be heavy, how you call it, attack on those territories late February. So it was kind of a preventive action, in fact, in order to allow for the civilians not to die again. And this is in the context of the West actually building those dividing lines. And this is why what I see now in this conflict is by no means Russia-Ukraine. It's not even Russia-West. It's not that bad for Brazil now, because Brazil still is okay with the role of their regional power, more or less. You are not trying to challenge in any way or close to challenging the United States. You as scholars would know that the United States in their security strategy, national security strategy, has the notion that it's a threat for them to have any country whose potential would be way too close. Why I say it's not just Russia to the West is that it's the attempt to destroy the country, Russia, with their cancel culture, with their military casualties and civilian casualties from both sides of Slavic nations, in order to ensure that, first of all, next would be easier to deal with, that is China, and that to ensure that within next, as much as possible years, there'll be no country that would be able to challenge this hegemony, no multipolar world. And that is why it is really important for the countries to see, for the other countries, non-golden billion countries, to see that it's not black and white. There are two sides to it. There are more than two sides to it. And we need to take that into account. And we could actually, another proof for that, apart from the system of fake news, system of fake videos, you could see that anti-Russia campaign has started much longer before 24th of February. And you could see that politicizing of areas that were never there actually occurred. Just imagine, well, it was after 24th, but imagine canceling Gergiev or Matsuev, like the world-known best pianist and composer, or talking about Russian sportsmen or Paralympic sportsmen. This was, I thought when there was a general attack on their Russian figure skater who was just 15. I don't want to discuss the details, who's right, who's wrong, but that was in fact kind of attack against the teenager. It was something strange. But when I saw Paralympic sportsmen being sent away, I thought this is just even below any possible bottom that you could see. So this is the, but all of that, their anti-Russian sentiment started being cultivated much before that. And Ukraine was one of the polygons there. As there's lots of discussions, and especially on the point that why we didn't do anything really substantive over the previous 30 years after the breakup of the Soviet Union to actually make sure that there's more efforts and more cooperation is put in place so that the West could not make an anti-Russia of Ukraine, because this was absolutely, now it's absolutely clear that this is what was built of Ukraine. And of course, now their society there as well is split. Those people who survived those 8 years in Donbass are extremely anti-Ukrainian, but the people who live in other parts and who had massive media coverage, which is anti-Russian, of course, not always would be perceptible of the reasons Russia is putting. That's obvious. And of course, another thing which needs to be discussed is those activities that were secretly done by United States that we're now getting more evidence. And we remember by their reaction of Victoria Nuland, and for example, when she said, no, we don't have anything, then on biolaboratories, so it's another story, which I remember first was raised after Crimea issue. Such lab was being built by Americans in Simferopol, but after Crimea went to Russia, it didn't put into effect. But probably nowadays, with people after COVID realizing how much it is a threat, the biological problem, after that, probably there'll be more attention to that. And I do have questions, why would they have such labs in their country and territories that are very much far away from United States, and they don't have pathogens that would be actually threatening for the United States people as well, themselves. So there are a whole range of questions, and I think I already talked too much. And now probably I've missed some of the points, but I hope I will be able to respond to them or remember them in the course of the discussion. Thank you, guys.
Thank you very much.
No, go, Augusto, please.
No, please, Juliana.
No, thank you very much, Victoria. It was very interesting to hear you and to learn more about the whole picture that you have on this conflict. That certainly is not something that started some weeks ago. It's related to a very big and long process of change in international relations. I have so many questions, but I'll leave them, or at least some of them, for later. Especially because I know that the people who are watching us may have a lot too. So without further delay, I'll pass the floor to Fabiano. Fabiano is a professor in the Political Science Department at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul. He works for the postgrad program in International Strategic Studies as well. He's an International Relations PhD from PUC-Rio, the Pontifical University of the Catholic University of Rio de Janeiro, and a master in international relations from the same institute. He's graduated social sciences at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul and also in political science. But last but not least, Fabiano is one of the persons in Brazil who understands better the Russian international insertion, the Russian foreign policy. So for us, I think it's going to be an honor to hear him. Thank you so much for accepting the invitation, Fabiano. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Juliano. I'm afraid I won't I won't attend the expectations that you created during my introduction. We're discussing with Victoria Panova, which was one of the most important scholars in international relations in Russia. So I'm a bit frightened with all this introductory note that you just mentioned. But I'd like to thank to Abedi for organizing this event. That's very important for us to talk to scholars that are involved in international security and international relations in general. I guess we can go a bit further than we are usually used to speak when we're taking part in TV programs or shows or interviews or things like that. I'd like to thank Victoria Panova. It was a pleasure listening to you, Victoria, and it's nice to be with you here. And Augusto, Daniela, Eduardo, and all the members of ABED. Well, I have a couple of things to say related to what Victoria just mentioned, but I'd like to organize it and more in a theoretical or theoretically oriented framework. Okay, I guess that the problem with the crisis that we're facing today, the war in Ukraine, it is related to at least two dimensions, which is very, very common for us in IR to talk about these dimensions. There's one dimension which is material, and it has to do with the dismembering or dismantling of the international order after the end of the Cold War, based on treaties that guaranteed security for all actors involved. And I would like to mention a couple of them. And also there's one dimension which is ideational, that has to do with ideas, and it has to do with identities and the way Russia was mistreated by the West during this period after the end of the Cold War. And so if you will, you don't need to be a constructivist to look at these perspectives or these two dimensions. You must just go and read the English school scholars that used to say something about the difference between the international system and the international society. Maybe this is one way to approach these different dimensions. But of course, my reading of the situation is clearly influenced by constructivism in IR. So, in terms of the material conditions and the whole architecture of security that was put in place during the Cold War and that was responsible for guarantee security in the international system after the Cold War, we have three treaties that are very important to take into account. The ABM Treaty from the 70s, that was unilaterally abandoned by the United States in the beginning of the 2000s. 2000, they denounced it. In 2001, it just ceased to exist. We have the conventional forces in Europe, which is from the late 80s, that limited armament of attack close to the frontiers of the Warsaw Pact and the Nato. So it did not work quite well during the 90s when NATO began its expansion, and many countries that used to belong to the Soviet Union and that were not members of the conventional forces in Europe entered into NATO and just said, no, we're not going to abide by that treaty. The Baltic states are the examples that we have in mind, and I have in mind here. And the last one, but not least, the INF, the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces in Europe, that was denounced by America in 2019, exactly when Zelensky got to power in Ukraine. So these three treaties were treaties that guaranteed security in Europe, and they were destroyed by the unilateral policies of NATO and the US after the end of the Cold War. Okay, of course, there are many things that we can debate whether Russia or America were responsible for the ending of these treaties, but the fact is that they do not work anymore. The most important of these treaties for me is the ABM, the Anti-Ballistic Missile or Missile Treaty. Okay, Why is that so important? And then as we're talking to scholars from the strategic studies field, we can go into details. When we talk about nuclear deterrence, we're thinking always in terms of guaranteeing strategic security. We're thinking always in terms of not letting clear to your opponent that you can attack someone without being attacked after. So you can start a nuclear war with the first strike. You cannot hinder someone from doing that or some country from doing that, but you can assure that once someone starts a nuclear war, there will be a answer, and that answer will be the mutual assured destruction, which is the principle that holds for that treaty, which is the MAD, which in English, of course, the acronym means MAD. So that's what guarantees the strategic security of countries that are nuclear powers. What happened in 2000? America just said, okay, you know what? The world has changed and we have new enemies, Iran, North Korea, and Iraq. Okay, the axis of evil. I don't know if you remember that, but that was the way it was propelled to the world, that America had to protect itself from these three countries. And so they denounced the treaty. They start creating a anti-ballistic missile system in America. And then after the European partners complain about that, they start creating that in Europe. It was launched in 2007, 2008. Remember the crisis between Putin and Hillary Clinton when Obama was president of the United States, because NATO wanted to create that system in Europe to protect Europeans against an attack from Iran. And then the Russians said, hey, look at the map and you see that if you put this anti-missile system in Europe, you're not saving the southern part of Europe. And probably the missiles from Iran are coming from south. So let's do that together and build in Azerbaijan an anti-missile shield. And so the Americans said, no, we're going to do that. By that time, it was supposed to be built in the Czech Republic and Poland. But after some problems, they did that in Romania, and it's operational since 2016. And now they are finishing the missile shield in Poland, which was supposed to become operational this year. So this is very interesting because once the and if you look at the city Redzikowo in Poland, where the missile shield is being built, it's right in the north. It's impossible to explain why it's being built in the north of Poland to protect from an attack in Iran. But okay, that's a question of geography and logics that people need to deal with that. So Russians are very clear that this was supposed to be built to hinder a second strike from Russia in case the West attacks nuclearly Russia. So I guess this is what explains everything that's happening now. Of course, there are very many other elements that have to do with the relation between anti-Russian forces in Ukraine, nationalistic forces in Ukraine that were sponsored by the West during these years. It has to do with some politics inside Russia. But unfortunately, the war that is going on in Ukraine, in my view, has very little to do with Ukrainians and Russians. It has to do with the international order. It has to do with the claims of Russia for being acknowledged as a military power, as a great power, and not being heard these last 30 years. So, and that was the window of opportunity that Russia had to attack Ukraine now, while the missile shield in Poland is not operational. This is one part of the problem, and this is the material part of the problem. The ideational part of the problem is the humiliation that Russia has passed during the last 30 years. Okay, I would say 20 years, because when Putin got to power, luckily and thanks to the United States that started a war in the Middle East, that invaded Iraq, and that created all the turmoil in terms of oil market, and the prices of oil during the 2000s, they skyrocketed. So Russia got the money from there for reorganizing its armed forces and its defense systems and its defense in general. So after the 2000s, Russia was starting to face that situation. And you can see clearly that happening. During 2003, when America invaded Iraq, based on a lie that Saddam Hussein had linkage with international terrorism, Russia tried to organize a movement with France and with Germany to stop that war, and it didn't work. 5 years later, when Georgia attacked Russian soldiers in South Ossetia, Russia did something and invaded Georgia. And in 5 or 6 days, they ended the war, and they got the acknowledgement that the Georgia signed the treaty and acknowledged that Russia won the war. 5 years later. 5 years from that moment, in 2013, 2014, we had before the involvement of Russia in Syria, which is a clear signal that Russia had the power, the military power to get involved in a major conflict outside its territory, like NATO did. And we had the crisis in 2013 that led to the coup against Yanukovych, and then the annexation of Crimea. So Russia is organizing itself to advance its interests through force, because diplomatically it wasn't working. And there's a problem in that. If you go straight to the question of Ukraine and the crisis in Ukraine, what has happened in 2013? Okay, you had a president, and I won't get into details. If you want later, we can talk about that. If Yanukovych was a pro-Russia, and if Poroshenko was a pro-West, or before that, if Yushchenko was someone that was pro-West, or what else. And I won't get into these details. We can answer to questions specifically later. Okay, but what happened is that Ukraine was holding the same position it had during the previous 30 years, negotiating economic agreements with the West and negotiating economic agreements with Russia at the same time to see who would offer more. And that's what happened when Yanukovych abandoned the economic agreement with Europe and opted for an economic agreement with Russia. Okay, we call the association agreement with Europe and the Eurasia Economic Area with Russia. They did that as Ukrainian leaders has done for the previous 30 years. But the problem is that Europe, with Durão Barroso in the presidency of the European Commission, was really involved in getting that deal approved by Ukrainian authorities, because I don't know if you remember, but we had an economic crisis, very, very severe economic crisis in 2008, 2009, and we had Europe trying to solve the problem of markets to sell their products. And Ukraine has 43 million people that were eager to buy products from Europe. And of course, the economy of Ukraine was subsidized by Russia in terms of energy. And so Europe resorted to all means necessary to win that dispute with Russia. And hence, in December, in December 2013, before Yanukovych was overthrown, you could hear Durão Barroso asking people in Ukraine to go to the streets to protest and not go to their homes unless they had changed the position of their government. By the way, which was a legitimate government elected in 2010 and acknowledged by the international community, Yanukovych's government. Okay, so this is what led to the crisis that we had, to the annexation of Crimea, and to what came after. Okay, I won't get into details in terms of the humanitarian justifications that Russia is offering now, because I've heard these justifications coming from the West during the last 30 years. The situation that Victoria just described is very similar to the one in Kosovo, when NATO bombed Serbia to protect the Kosovars from something called or related to ethnic cleansing. And this is a problem, because if you have interventions that are not approved by the Security Council, and that's what we are used to in the last 30 years, it worked for all of the actors, okay? They might be true, but they might not be true. And so how can you judge it if you don't have a measure? And I think it's very difficult for me to accept. And for me, it's very comfortable to say that I oppose any kind of intervention that has not the approval of the Security Council of the United Nations after the Cold War. I disapprove them because I know that those that are great powers have the power to do whatever they want and to justify it later. So there is a precedent that was created by the West, and now Russia is using that. And how come that some people that were in favor of the interventions back then in the 90s now are saying that the justifications are not legitimate? So this is my view on this conflict. Unfortunately, people are dying. Unfortunately, people are suffering from both sides. And I do think that it has very little to do with the relations between Ukrainians and Russians. It has to do with something which is broader in terms of scope, and something that puts into question the whole architecture of security that was unilaterally built after the end of the Cold War, and that now needs to be renegotiated. So where can we go from here? Of course, negotiations between Russia and Ukraine will end up in a dead end. There's no way that Zelensky is going to acknowledge Crimea as Russian or the other two regions of Donbass as independent. Of course, if that happens, he's going to be killed by the nationalists in Ukraine. And there are so many things happening that we're not aware here in the West, like negotiators that are being killed by the Ukrainian side, members of the FSB in Kiev being killed by the Ukrainian side, and we're not talking about that in the West. There are many things going on, and it's very dangerous. If Zelensky accepts the terms, Zelensky is out of power. And he himself is asking the population to fight Russia tanks with Molotov cocktails made in their homes with the help of the Defense Ministry Facebook page, which is something totally crazy. I cannot conceive of that happening, okay? So this is impossible to solve that problem only with negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. There might be something related to what we used to see in IR during the last century, which are great big conferences involving different parts involved to solve the problem and to try to create an atmosphere of cooperation and collaboration, okay? Ukraine is too weak to negotiate with Russia, and Russia does not want to talk to Ukraine. They want to talk with the West. And so this must be acknowledged first, so that we can try to stop the war and negotiate the new architecture of security in the world that is going to stabilize the international system. This is one thing very important that must be recognized. What NATO can do now, okay? Because Ukraine and the Ukraine presidency cannot accept the terms that Russia is imposing, NATO has to take some measures if they want to stabilize the situation. Maybe to declare a moratorium in terms of entrance in the alliance, to give space for negotiations to happen in the future. Maybe trying to negotiate what Russia wants with what Ukraine wants, and putting other countries as well in the equation, bringing China to the equation, bringing Turkey to the equation, Israel to the equation, NATO to the equation, and all these parts involved can try to negotiate a way to stop the violence and to think of a new architecture for the international system. Okay, so these are my my initial remarks, and I'd like to share them with you. And again, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity. And I'm here and I can follow you in the questions. Okay, thank you very much.
Can I say a few words? I very much agree with what Fabiana has been saying, but just a few words, if you don't mind.
Well, please, Victoria, feel free for it.
Thank you so much. Definitely very well positioned with the Conventional Forces Treaty. It's definitely, you know, it's in fact have been, at least I'm quite sure the West have known that it will be dead from the very start, because it's been signed on the block between Warsaw Pact and NATO on the concentration circles principles. Well, those 5 types of weaponry would be kind of further away from their each other's borders, but when it's practically flew all into NATO counter Russia, and as you rightly said, Baltic states would say is a gray zone in there, where it is possible to do something and to concentrate weaponry without breaking the treaty, because they say, well, it was illegitimate to be part of it, so we're not joining it. So it was a gray zone, and it was, of course, a real threat, which was not, for some reason, also very much discussed openly and not acknowledged by the West. So I'm thankful for that. And with their, and actually very similar thing with Ukraine. And with their, you mentioned about ABM and those radio location stations in Romania and Poland. Definitely, it was never meant against Iran, because if you look at the geometry, not just geography. But what's worse, recent events in Ukraine would ensure that there would be no even ability to control counter-Russian activities that would be militarily done on Ukraine in this realm. So this is in fact matter of survival of state. You remember I started with it, and thank you for demonstrating, but I just wanted to emphasize that some extra details. And with Crimea, one thing to add, I would not agree that humanitarian aid to people who are actually also Slavs or Russians, it doesn't matter. It does matter. But of course, when we talk about Ukraine, we talk about Sevastopol and the desire of then coming after coup government, Ukrainian government, willing to oust their Chernomorsky fleet, navy, and put NATO. So this is direct threat. And similarly, not just biolabs, but military buildup in Ukraine would constitute this another gray zone right on the border of Russia, which would very much be kind of compromising its independence in a way, and sovereign existence. So just few mentions, and thank you for that. That was good.
Well, thank you very much, Victoria, for your intervention. Certainly, it adds a lot to what Fabiano already put it in the table. Well, we now will pass to the questions, primarily from me and Juliano, the moderators, and after the questions of our audience. In that sense, I first have 2 questions, one for each. First to Professor Victoria, in which I would like to ask, in your perspective, in your vision, what are essentially the main objectives of Russia in the military, special military operation in the Ukraine? And why do I ask that? Because if we see or analyze Putin's speech explaining to the Russian public why he was doing that, it seems that they had something like broad and limited political objectives, normally thinking on the ideas as demilitarization and denazification of the Ukrainian state. But if we see the amount of military power employed and how it's being employed, and the terms that are leaking in the debate of the press about the negotiations, the objective seems normally to be much more limited in order to, first of all, halting NATO expansions eastward, but also to recognize formally Crimea and Donbass security understandings and needs in order to fulfill another security architecture. That being said, in your opinion, what are the main drivers? What are the main objectives? And to Professor Fabiano, it's very important to shed light in the nuclear debate surrounding the actual crisis. Normally, we have in Brazil, in specialists, between specialists, trained to highlight how this can be understood as a hybrid war and things like that. And that normally puts us aside of seeing important strategic dynamics that are probably more causal in explaining what things are how they are. And that being said, my question to you is like, how do you react to positions of scholars like Edward Luttwak, who says that Russia's claim that putting NATO forces or NATO missiles or NATO capability in Ukraine doesn't reduces Russia's second strike capabilities, because normally those capabilities are deployed deeper in the state or abroad. So that would not be a real problem in terms of equilibrium, in terms of strategic equilibrium between the two countries. If you could explain that better for we to understand how Russia perceives that as an existential threat and not only a data on equilibrium, it would be great. Okay, well, I will pass the word to Professor Vittoria and Fabiano. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Augusto. Well, I think if you look at what's being put in there, kind of Russian demands for United States and NATO in December, that would be the baseline. But nowadays, when we already have the crisis ongoing, it's definitely would be about demilitarization. It should be neutral Ukraine. It would definitely be about the three, Crimea and Donbass, Lugansk as independent, recognize, because I don't see other possible ways for Russia to go on. But demilitarization is primary, because this would allow to avoid this existential threat that's been coming from extra military presence in Ukraine. But actually, drawing on what Fabiano has said earlier, with what NATO wants, I would say NATO is not interested in ending the conflict. The aim would be to prolong it as much as possible, probably in a way to ensure that Ukraine is not defeated. That is why we're seeing weaponry, lethal weaponry, try to be a kind of supplied with such weapons. Although from what we see from military operation now, we realize how much has already been supplied there, because for the military infrastructure that's been built with Western military supplies is a deep shielded and it's directed against Russia. So we see there's been a preparations, very thorough ones, and those supplies continue now. So it will depend a lot on how Russia is able to prevent and to cut those supplies. So NATO is interested in this conflict ongoing and ensuring that Russia is weakened, and that ensure that this campaign in addition to the sanctions that they imposed, gives more damage to Russia. And because as you saw, even from what Fabiano has been saying, nobody is interested in having prosperous Ukraine for themselves. It's just a polygon for ensuring Russia doesn't live calmly, and that there is a way to put reins on this country and to ensure that it's weakened. And another thing I think I forgot to mention, and that needs to be taken into account, this is not just about geopolitics of territory and countering Russia with all their things we've talked about. Russia and United States have been for a long time rivals in terms of weapons exports. And what's happening now is actually also very much harming the ability of Russia. And over the past years, we saw those activities actually harming Russian possibilities for weapons exports. So it's also a way to ensure ousting Russia off this market as much as possible. So if I'm clear, I hope I am.
Well, yes, you were. Thank you very much. Professor Fabiano.
Okay, thanks, Augusto, for your question. A very good one indeed. In terms of strategic interest and deterrence, there's one, then we can go into details. As you know, I'm a IR scholar and a very strong theoretical approach to empirical issues, okay? So please correct me if I'm wrong. Talking about the military capacities and the material capacities of NATO versus Russia, okay? The missiles that were built and deployed to Romania and now are going to be operational in Poland were the SM-3 Block IB, the Standard Missile 3 Block IB. They were launched from a platform, which is the Mark 41 vertical launch system, which is also compatible with surface-to-air missiles and Tomahawk missiles. So this is what Russia is calling attention to the world, okay? They are building this defense system with platforms that can easily become platforms for attacking Russia. So even if you discuss where the shield is located in terms of defense, it might be seen as an arm of attack. So I guess Russia has a very good point. The problem is that in the West, we tend to look at Russia as a pathological liar. That's the way Russia is being canceled by the media, and that's the way Western powers try to legitimate actions of violence against Russia. So I'm very worried with what is happening in the world, because I think that everything is being prepared for a major war. But we just realized that after years it has happened, and then we start thinking and looking at the past and thinking, oh, how come that humanity got to such a stupid situation called war? So this is one thing that worries me most in this moment, okay? All these rational, because they're rational, they have to do with this discipline called strategic studies in international relations security. Many scholars, even in America, in Russia, they agree that there is something going on, but at the level of public opinion, we're not talking to people, we're not debating, and the press is not open to discuss these arguments as legitimate. That's why we got to this situation of war, violence, people being killed. And that's why if we do not change the perspective we're looking to this situation, we can go even further in terms of a major scale war. So this is what worries me. in terms of the situation of deterrence. So I would answer to you that, okay, it might be easily convertible to an attack against Russia.
Thank you very much. Professor Juliano, please.
Thank you so much, Augusto. It was very interesting hearing you both. I learned a lot, as I already expected, but you two overwhelmed my expectations. I have some questions related to what we've been hearing and reading here in the West. First, Victoria, there is a sense here in the United States, but also I see that in Brazil, that there was a strong miscalculation by Putin, who didn't expect the kind of resistance that's being held by the Ukrainian people. And there seems to be a sense that he overemphasized the power of the Russian military. So some analysts are saying now that we discovered that Russia is much weaker than we thought at first. So in a sense, instead of strengthening Russia's positions, this war is actually weakening Russia's positions related to the international balance of power because of logistical problems in the field and things like this. So do you think that the Russian army, the Russian armed forces are moving slower than expected by Putin and than planned by him? Or is that part of the plan, part of the whole initial way of seeing how to promote the evolution of this war? I ask you this because, that's the first question. I'm going to ask you a second one. I'm sorry for that, but what do you see as the way out? Fabiano talked about how difficult a negotiation will be, and the fact that Zelensky cannot give what Russians are asking for. But what do you see as the way out? I mean, because if Zelensky is moved out of power, Russia is going to have many difficulties in rebuilding the country and establishing a new government, especially because of what we've been seeing around the Ukrainian nationalism. So what do you think that's going to happen? I've been asked this question many times during the last weeks. So I'm hoping that you have a better answer than I do. And for Fabiano, I fully agree with you and your thoughts on the possibility of having, I'll go on with the debate proposed by Augusto, with the possibility of changing defense structures into attack structures. But what do you? But don't you think that Russian deterrence is actually more connected to the second strike capability, to the second strike one, instead of being able to, not to avoid an attack instead of giving it back to the West? Let's put it that way. And another question that I have for you, and I'm very worried. I agree with you when you say that you're worried about the possibility of us having I wouldn't say a third world war, but a major war between powers, and we can't imagine what that would look like. But since you dealt with constructivism in your presentation, how do you think we could decrease the chance that possibility? How do you think we can avoid that? I mean, if there is so much prejudice against Russia and things like this. Thank you.
Shall I start? Okay.
Please.
Okay. So with your questions, with the first question, obviously I cannot read the mind of our president of what's happening in there at the moment. But first of all, seeing that there are yet no counter sanctions introduced, I would rather say there were no immediate plans to do it. So it was some kind of necessity that grew out of the latest intelligence information that Russian forces got. So, and I guess it looks like there was a kind of hope that they will be restrained and this would not be going into their necessity of going into hot conflict. But from what I see now ongoing for the past 2.5 weeks, right? Russian forces have very strict order not to touch civilians. Nowadays, and you saw it from what Americans were doing whenever they invaded any country, they would start with shelling with artillery and air force, the cities, and only then they enter. And from what I remember, it took them like how many, 4 months to get to Baghdad, even with Iraqi army being like really already under sanctions for a long time, already not having any real military capacity. So I might be mistaken, but I think it was 4 months. And all of that after them shelling and not caring about the losses of civilians in those cities. We have Ukraine, which is a neighboring state. Of course, we're portrayed as barbarians, and of course, there is an enormous and really severe info warfare against Russia. And of course, population in Ukraine is not all the population in Ukraine is perceiving the Russian point of view, that's for sure. Nevertheless, we need not ruins next to us, we need normal country. So this is why this order is being strictly held. So when today, for example, we saw the Ukrainian so-called .u, Fabiana would know, it's only, that's a type of artillery. We don't have it in the Russian army since 2019 at all. So it came to their civilian residential areas of Kharkov. And in fact, there was some evidence that Ukrainians tried to gather there more civilians for like kind of asking about like mothers of mobilized. So this is what is being tried to do by the other side in order to ensure that Russia is demonized ever further. But even counter to Russia, in fact, losing info warfare, understanding this is, those are people living next to us, we need to keep this country as much alive as possible. So there's why this order presupposes that in a country which is armed really heavily by the West, it's been armed for a really long time, where you have the order not to destroy cities and not to destroy civilians, I would say this is not a bad speed at all. That would be kind of my perception and my analysis, because nowadays I try to read a lot of news, obviously from there, but not from official media, because both sides, be it from Russia, be it from the West, they portray opposite results. But I'm trying to look into people that I know, for example, work correspondents on the ground, but that I trust, that are there, that don't necessarily go to central TV. So I would say it should have been understandable, and I think Putin has not been born yesterday, and he has a good background to understand that it would have not been an easy path. I think he should have understood, even if he is not reported all the kind of hard truth, that after coup in 2014, and specifically after after 2014 specifically, Ukraine would be very much informationally how would you say that? Forget in English. Ensure that it's against Russia, right? On the level of civilians as well. So especially that I know it was not quite safe in the areas which were not under Donbass and Lugansk regions to say their view. Just remember 2014 and Odessa. This was terrible trade union building burnings, and with the people who, pro-Russian protesters who just said their mind. And later on, there were not such big events, but people still disappeared, especially the ones who would say pro-Russian view. So it was clear that population is either kind of under Western influence or simply afraid to think differently, and that is why it tries to keep below any radar. So I would say he should have known, and I'm quite sure he should have known, that this would not be a blitzkrieg because of those preparations that were clearly reported by the intelligence of the war preparations and with the help of the West. And nevertheless, he still gave this order not to touch civilians. So he realized that this would be compromising the speed. But it's not as much about, I know Fabiana doesn't like humanitarian pretexts, but as I say, this is not a faraway country where you intervene, which you leave in tatters, just sands and some stones, and then you go away, right? This is the country that is next to us. And this is a very legitimate order. How to finish this fast? When you were talking about Zelensky, I would, this is also my personal analysis. I shared it with some of my kind of fellow colleagues, and probably some of us, we share the sentiment. I would say probably Zelensky now is somewhat more dangerous and being way too much overseen by the West and Nazis. He's in a way, I see him as a hostage at the moment. Fabiana said he would be killed if he accepts the Russian propositions. I would say probably the only way for him would be to somehow get and to stay alive, in fact, and stay in profession, put it this way, would be to manage somehow to get and be supervised by, I don't know how to put it better, not supervised, but be under protection of Russian forces, because I would see that he's used as an instrument. So nobody cares in the West about him as a kind of president of independent Ukraine. He's just used for their purposes, and Nazis, Nazbats, nationalists, they have their own interests. So he cannot decide independently while he is there, and he would not be, but I think so he will stay there, and thus would be kind of continue serving this instrument. That's it.
Well,
Yeah.
Okay. No, thanks. I would say, regarding to that Victoria just said, I would say that if Russia starts an indiscriminate assault on civilians, Russian population wouldn't accept that. And in the West, there is this vision that Russia is ruled by an autocrat, that is a despot, and that controls everyone. And you know what? Russian people are very smart and intelligent. They know what's happening in the world. They know why they chosen Putin. They have criticisms regarding to Putin, but it would be very difficult, I would say impossible, for Russia to act like that towards Ukraine without the Russian population um, creating a uprising against the government. So this is I guess this is another thing that maybe in the West we are not able to understand, because we try to demonize. We are used to demonizing Putin and creating Putin as someone that is a totalitarian leader that manipulates Russian population. I don't agree with that reading. Okay, I think it's way more complex than that. And so this is one thing that I'd like to emphasize regarding to what Victoria just said. But in what concerns your two questions, Juliano, well, yeah, of course, the second strike is a worry that Russia has. But I would like just to mention the other capacity of you transforming a defense military capacity to an attack one, which is this ambiguity relating to these material capabilities is something that we need to take into account too. Okay, but of course the problem with shields is that you just know that they work when they're put into working. So you need to test it. And I wouldn't go that far to have this confirmation if it's working or not, because it may or may not work. And so, but then you need to be just based on hypothesis and thinking theoretically what might have happened. In terms of avoiding a major war, I think there are urgent needs to de-escalate the conflict. And you mentioned the constructivism of my perspective, and I would remember that anarchy is what states make of it. So you can create this identity of enmity, or you can create one of friendship. And what do you need to get there is to start taking measures that are going to assure to your opponent that you are really serious in that regard. So de-escalating the conflict won't be possible with Russia and Ukraine, that are both involved in a conflict. Okay, Russia had the experience of Georgia, and that was very easy because the West wasn't very involved in Georgia, and they were not trying to support Saakashvili with what they did, the Georgian forces did in 2008. But now the West is supporting and has a strategic interest regarding to Ukraine. So Russia won't have the same situation it had in 2008, and Ukraine won't be able to negotiate with Russia because of all that we've mentioned here. So who is the one responsible for de-escalating this crisis? NATO and the US. What are they doing? Selling arms and training Ukraine. So that's why I suspect that they're not really worried with that or interested in that. They want to keep the sanctions, and they think that they are going to create a problem for Putin's legitimacy and create a situation so bad in Russia that people are going to overthrow Putin. I don't think it's going to happen, because Russia has planned that in advance, and Russia has planned that with China. And there is a support that China is giving to Russia, and it's a question of time for the whole international order changed in terms of what we had experienced so far. So these are things that I guess we need to take into consideration. If NATO declare a moratorium in terms of newcomers to the alliance for 20 years or 25 years, maybe we would have space or room for people to negotiate. If it doesn't happen, probably we're gonna see the crisis escalating, And we're going to get used to that. And maybe Ukraine is going to be totally occupied or divided in the middle, the Dnieper River, which is something that is possible nowadays. Okay, I think that the West is responsible for solving this crisis. This is my view, okay? People are going to say that, okay, I'm criticizing the West, I'm not considering other aspects. But, you know, if you take the history of the relations between Russia and the West, you know, I need to blame the West for doing that because it didn't recognize or acknowledge the role that Russia could play in a different order. This is my view.
Thank you a lot.
Thanks very much for the questions.
Oh, thanks a lot for what you told us, and Professor Victoria also. Well, we have also questions from our audience, and the first question was made by Horácio de Souza Ramalho to Professor Panova, and he asks you, in your vision, what was the main drivers for Russian action right now in 2022, but not in years soon after 2014? In your opinion, what would the Western diplomatic mistakes in the process of crisis escalation? Was it clear, the question made by Horácio?
So he is asking if what triggered the reaction now, or did I?
Yeah, probably what triggered the reaction now in 2022, but not previous, after 2014.
Okay.
Victoria, excuse me.
Yeah.
Fabiano is saying that he needs to leave. He has a family appointment now. So,
oh yes, sorry guys, I need to get my daughter at school, so I've got to go. Okay, thank you very much for this debate, Victoria. It was a pleasure being with you, and I hope maybe if there's some questions addressed to me, please send to my email. I'm gonna be glad to answer them. Okay.
Thank you so much, Fabiano, for everything.
Thank you, Fabiano.
This morning. I'm sorry about that, Victoria.
No problem.
Well, we'll miss Fabiano, but
yes.
Nevertheless. So first of all, this is impossible to get this conflict away from history. So this has been building up. This cannot have happened without the previous buildup. And that is why I started with their events of 30 years ago and then how they evolved, including the color revolution and then the coup, of which Fabiano has been also talking. But it was clear, at least for me, that something bad would be ongoing after Russia actually asked in December last year, and it provided, those are red lines. Guys, you have to give us legal guarantees, legal security guarantees. Some piece of paper, which the West doesn't really honor in any case, but nevertheless, it was still something Russia would go with. And what Russia got in response was just simply buzz off. I'm sorry. And then from what I understand, and there are more evidence proving that there were, first of all, intelligence evidences saying about their very soon planned counterattack against the new republics, the Donbass and Lugansk, the massive one with their with the hard artillery, etc. And I would say another would be one of the other triggers would be Zelensky talking about their possibility of nuclear bomb. Of course, there is no evidence of what's ongoing, but interestingly, a few days ago, Ukrainians have their battalions, their Nazbats have blew up their Physics Technical Institute, which was known for having some works in this area, which was connected to this type of possible research. So it's interesting that it's being destroyed, it's been blown up. Of course, not just logics, not put in parallels, but for your consideration. So I would say, because like something like biolabs and what's been in there was taken hold of only later along the operation, not before. But those two things of the massive attack, planned massive attack, and Zelensky talk about nukes, actually together with their absolute ignoring from the West and saying that we're not going to give you any legal guarantees of your security, right? So it's gave it a sense of urgency. That's how I see it. That's as I said, I'm trying to read all types of resources apart from official ones, and talk to people who are there now as journalists and who are doing investigative research on the ground. So it's looks pretty, how you put it, looks pretty scary of what could have been the consequences, and in fact quite a few specialists, experts agree that this more looks like a version of a bigger war, at least what's happening now, and especially if Russian forces will continue to have the same order of being very careful about civilians, of not touching civilians, then it definitely is more looking like a version of the bigger conflict with the involvement of all sides and the use of other weapons that are much more serious than conventional ones.
Well, thank you very much for your answer, Professor Victoria. We have another question from our audience, from Heron Boaventura Belmoc, and he asks us, what are the perspectives on the economic future of Russia, considering the Western sanctions? Could China play a much greater role in Russia's present future economy? That's his main question for you, Professor Victoria.
Thanks. Well, that's a very important one. And the problem is that for quite some time, we've been, in Russia, we've been talking about their, how you call it, in Russian, it's importozamещение, which is making our own stuff in critical areas instead of imported stuff. The problem with Russians and Russia, and it's been throughout our history, is that we even have such a proverb. And the proverb says, the man would not use the cross before, crucified before there is thunder on him. So that means we take things kind of easily and saying, okay, maybe it will happen someday, without putting too much effort even into something that there is a sense of urgency. But until there is real crisis, there will be not much done. So of course, as you see from objective figures like their drop in value of ruble, a number of foreign companies are leaving their market, etc. It's not an easy walk. But at the same time, I would see there are two major, well, let's start with two major implications. First of all, Russia is quite good at being mobilized. So what you kind of, you're laid for quite some time, but then when you need to mobilize, you do things fast and good. So this is a good way for Russia to finally start doing something of their own without being too much reliant on the West. Of course, we're not talking about total isolation. Of course, there is India, there is China, there is Brazil, there are other countries, and we definitely need to keep up the cooperation because this would ensure better development for each of us, not just for Russia. But when we talk about economy, Russia is in a quite a unique position. In terms of resources, we have, I think we're the only country that has all the rare earth metals, the only one in the world, all of them. I think they're 22, right? If I'm not mistaken. So we have energy resources necessary for running industries. We have water. Brazil and Russia are the two countries that are number 2 and 1 in Brazilian case in terms of water supplies. So we have human capital. Of course, there are some fears and some people are leaving, but I do not expect any drastic brain drain, which would be, in fact, going over previous problematic times that we had, like in the 1990s, for example. So there are all the prerequisites for Russia to wake up, to start looking more into the BRICS or other countries like that, and go ahead with the mutual cooperation. Of course, those sanctions with the SWIFT, they also create problems. But on the other hand, it also shows, not just to Russia, but to the world, that what used to be proposed as okay, this is common good, this is for everybody, it doesn't depend on politics. Everybody sees, so if you're not liked by the big brother, you will be disconnected. So of course, now everybody understands, everyone from other countries understand they need some kind of guarantees. So probably there'll be a way to create finally this new alternative system, which would not be based just on one country or few countries' decisions, but would be equally responsibility equally shared. So, and here it would be in national interest of all the BRICS countries, in fact, but also some ASEAN. So it is clearly important for international financial system to find a way to function and in fact de-dollarize. If you remember their first discussions in BRICS, they were exactly about de-dollarization. It was more than 10 years ago. Then it kind of moved further to other issues, but probably this issue is back with such behavior and kind of non-UN, but unilateral sanctions introduced by United States and Europe. So I think there is a way to solve those issues. Russia still has the potential, and solution of those interests is in the interests not just of Russia, but all of us, all the non-golden billion ones. So I think it would be not easy. But another problem with Russia, which probably the West miscalculated, is that majority, not everybody there, different people, of course, but majority does consolidate in the times of crisis and is able to do many more things and is actually countering any pressure. The more you have pressure, the more you have this resistance and resilience on the part of the country. and its people. So I think we will be able to go through those times, and what needs to be done now is, and I think the work is being done now, there needs to be found out discussions of what are the counter sanctions. Because for now, their government only introduced measures for anti-crisis solutions for the country, mostly. Things that are vital for the West that introduce sanctions, like REMs, rare earth metals, or energy sources, for whom it is important, like Europe. They don't touch it. They don't touch Titan. They don't touch uranium. I mean, come on. So agricultural, not products, but also fertilizers, right? Those are important things, and I believe, first of all, there's a market for those vital things elsewhere, but not in the West. And I think this would, in a long run, benefit the other countries who chose the way of kind of non-confrontation. Let's put it this way. I don't know if I answered it, but I did my best. Of course, I cannot project of what would be the ruble versus dollar in a week, of what would be their kind of general prices. Of course, inflation is high, but I don't see such drastic problems, for example, as shortages of food or shortages of fuel. And I don't think people would be very much, well, some youth, of course, are, but it's not a big problem, not life-threatening problem not to have McDonald's or Gucci present on the territory. Some people say it's even better for the health. So we're happy for the West to take care of our health finally.
That was a good one. I'm living in the US, so my kids love McDonald's, so my health's not so nice right now. But thank you so much, Victoria. I would have more questions, but I'll leave you with those from the audience and from us. It was a great pleasure hearing you and learning so much from you this morning. I think indeed we needed this conversation with you and Fabiano. I think that this bet on sanctions as a way to end the conflict is nonsense. I agree with you on that, and I think that these sanctions are a way of trying to bring Putin to the negotiation table. Although I also agree with the fact that Russians have been more open to negotiate something than the Western powers, unfortunately. And I'm actually very, very afraid of the escalation process that we've been seeing. Sometimes we read about the world wars, and we ask ourselves about how the situation got so bad. We normally read what's going on the field by a Western perspective right now. So it's very important and very interesting to hear from you, to hear from how things are seen in Russia. And I think that if we have more of these opportunities, we will understand the different perspectives. That was our goal here, and that will lead us to a stronger common ground in which we can build from. So I just have to thank you so much for accepting the invitation, for being so open to answer the questions. And I hope we keep in touch. Last time I saw you was in a BRICS meeting some years ago. And I hope we can see each other soon in a more peaceful future. I would like to also thank you, Augusto, for hosting the event with me. Great questions. It's always great to hear from you. It's been a long time since we don't see each other as well. And I hope we can all get together for another conversation soon. Thank you so much, Victoria.
Thank you. So hope maybe we can close this with all their turbulences. Maybe I will be very happy to invite you and see you over in Russia for the BRICS chairship in 2024. So would be good to meet offline finally.
All right.
But I would be happy, of course, to have more discussions like that. So if you find it useful, we can arrange more, like even regular webinars on different issues. So I would be happy to answer questions as much as in my competence and my knowledge.
That would be very interesting. We actually can look for ways to leave these conversations going on for future opportunities as well. That would be very interesting. And I would be eager to learn more from you. Thank you so much, Victoria. Thank you for the audience as well. Thank you, Augusto. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Juliano. Thank you, Professor Victoria. It was excellent, great to learn from you this morning. I believe that for our defense studies community, here a Russian perspective, analytical, is very important in order that in Brazil, normally, we will only address how the Western powers sees the conflict. So normally, it's very important for us to try to understand the other side in order to have a glimpse of the bigger picture. That being said, I really appreciate your time, your attention, and the quality of your presentation that not only held the historical problem and how we came to this, but helps us to see some glimpses of how the future probably will be, in order that probably we are now living in a changing moment of multipolarity or a polycentric order in which some geopolitical process may be accelerated. That being said, in the name of the Brazilian Defense Studies Association, we would like to thank you a lot, Professor Victoria, Professor Fabiano, who left us early, and of course, Professor Juliano, who organized all this, and in cooperation with his research group in our project, PROCAD in GEPSI, making this possible by the efforts of ABED. So have everyone a very good day. We expect that this war will end soon and peace may prevail for all sides in the conflict. Thank you very much for you all.
Victoria, be sure to read the messages. There are messages for you in the YouTube link later. Walter Desidera from IPEA is saying that it's very good to hear from you again. Many people are saying thank you. There is a Professor Herman Gia from Venezuela watching us. So I'm just quoting some of them, but I'll send you the link for the presentation later so you can read some of the messages that they're going to stay there. So a lot of people are thanking you for the presentation, and we thank the audience as well. Thank you so much, Victoria.
So I really do hope we have more instances for such a talk, and I would be really happy. And I think this is very important that we have different views and different approaches. So, and one thing, I'm proud to be Russian, and I'm happy that we're talking to Brazilians, we're talking to Venezuelans, and I'm very much happy to know that there is a world, to still get another evidence, there is a world beyond the golden billion, and probably together we can solve even the most difficult issues like this crisis or others. And I think this is in the common interest of our future, where we all are equal, we all are safe, And that is why I'm ready to do anything to ensure we have, as you are, we have such discussions, we have such exchange of opinions, and this way probably we can bring the solution closer, because this is extremely important. Thank you.